I am writing this under an applicable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more, penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid streets below. Do not think of my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never really fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to a German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their latter degeneration, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due to us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhere south of the equator. Of that longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting for some either passing ship or that the cast on the shores of some inhabitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I begun to despair in my solitude upon heaving vastnesses of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When I at last awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as the eye could see, and which my boat lay grounded in some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was, in reality, more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to my very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of a decaying fish and of other, less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in the absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very contemptness of the stillness and the homogeny of the landscape oppressed me with nauseating fear. The sun was blazing from a sky which seemed to be almost as black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unexpected volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for unmeasurable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain upon my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours, I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the lost ground saved more of its stillness, and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made myself a pack containing food and water, proprietary to an overladen journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with the graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any of the elevation of the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled forward towards the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first ellipsed it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared to be from a distance. An intervening valley, setting it out sharper than relief from the general surface, too wary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but airy the warning and fantastically gibbous moon that had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in cold precipitation, determined to sleep no more. Such visions I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise it had been to travel that day. Without the glare of the pacing sun, my journey would have cost me less energy indeed. Now I felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was the source of a vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down on the other side of the irremeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses of the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim of the fathomless chaos of the eternal night, though my terror ran curious reminiscence of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashionable realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Legends and outcroppings of a rock afforded fairly easy footholds for my descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, a debility became very gradual. Urged by some impulse that which I cannot definitely analyze, I succumbed with a difficulty down the rocks and stood at the gentler slopes beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in a newly bestowed rays of the ascended moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was soon conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and positions were not altogether with that of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude, and its position in an abyss which yet yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that this strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of a living, thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of a scientist or an archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that the far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of the sight of both directions, and almost lapping my feet as they stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets and washed upon the base of the Cyclopean monolith. on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing in the system of the hieroglyphics, unknown to me, and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books, consisting for both the part of the conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters, oblivious representative of marine things, which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed from the ocean-risen plains. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to me spellbound, plainly visible across the intervening water on account of the enormous size, were an array of bas reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy upon the dour. I think these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown decomposing like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to a certain monolithic shrine, which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for a mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imaginations of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human, in genuine outline despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide with flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportions with the scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in an act of killing a whale represented by as little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing tribe, some tribe whose last descendants were now perished eras of the first ancestors of Piltdown, where the Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond comprehension of the most daring archaeologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark the rise to its surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, polynthius-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave a vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the Slofen cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the strange boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed loudly when I was unable to sing. I have the undistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder and other tones of which nature utters only in her wildest of moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in San Francisco Hospital, brought thither by the captain of an American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but I found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, of my rescues knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon the thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out to celebrate a celebrated ichthyologist, and amused him with particular questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has only given transient pleasure. It has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. Now I'm at the end of it all. Having written a full account of the information or not contemptuous amusement of my fellow men, often I ask myself if I could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever that I had laid sun-stricken and raving in the open boat at the end of my escape of the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideous, vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may be at the very moment crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of the day when we may rise above the billowings to drag down in their reeking talons and remain of their puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of the day when the land shall sink, and the dark oceans shall ascend upon the amidst the universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. They shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!